Good morning. I am so happy that you all got here in the weather. I'm Vicki Kennedy. On behalf of our Executive Director, Art Buckland, and the Board of Directors, I am so pleased to welcome you to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate this morning for our very, very special Getting to the Point program. It's always meaningful to have a United States Senator visit us here and join us in our replica of the Senate chamber here on Columbia Point in Boston. But it's especially meaningful to be joined by a candidate for the presidential nomination of his party. And it's especially significant to have a United States Senator here when such historic actions are taking place today on Capitol Hill. So, with a special shout out to the students from Lynn English, I thank you all for being here. When my late husband, Senator Edward Kennedy, first contemplated the creation of this institute more than 15 years ago, he had a list of things he wanted to accomplish. First, he wanted to educate the public about the Senate that he loved so much. And he wanted to do it in a hands-on, experiential way. That's why he insisted on this replica of the United States Senate chamber. He wanted all of us to be able to walk onto the Senate floor and feel what it was to be a senator, to feel the awe and majesty of the place, and to remember the hard work and dedication of the men and women of goodwill and both parties who came together to address the great challenges facing our nation. Even though he couldn't have anticipated at the time how much we would need it, he wanted this place to be a center that encouraged civil discourse, a place where citizens could come together to discuss tough issues and find a way when necessary to reach compromise. He also wanted this to be a place where we could hear and learn from and question our nation's leaders about the important issues of the day. He wanted to encourage active participation in our democracy, active citizenship, and in the process, he hoped to inspire our next generation of leaders. Our featured speaker this morning, Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado, is one of our nation's inspirational leaders. And trust me when I say that there is no greater compliment that I could pay to anyone. I believe that he is cut from the same public service cloth as Ted Kennedy. Senator Bennet was sworn into the United States Senate in 2009. My husband passed away in 2009, but their service in the Senate did overlap very briefly. And in that short time, Ted recognized Michael Bennet's leadership qualities, his pragmatism, his independence of thought, and his drive to create opportunity for the next generation. During these past 10 years in the Senate, Senator Bennet has built a reputation as someone willing to take on dysfunction in DC. And like all great senators in history, he has reached across the aisle, working with Republicans and Democrats to address our nation's greatest challenges. He has also developed a reputation among staff and colleagues as someone who knows what he's talking about, a voracious reader who immerses himself in the issues, who prepares, who studies, who is constantly expanding his knowledge. Drawing on that knowledge, Senator Bennet has authored innovative proposals to make education, healthcare, childcare, and housing more affordable and accessible for working families. He has made climate change a top priority, helping farmers, ranchers, and rural communities become more resilient to changing weather, and investing in clean energy. As a member of the bipartisan Gang of Eight, he helped create comprehensive immigration reform that overwhelmingly passed the Senate. It got stuck in the House. He worked to dramatically reform No Child Left Behind, fast-track the FDA approval process for breakthrough medical treatments, conserve iconic public lands, promote clean energy, and crack down on the illicit prescription of opioids. He also was central in crafting and passing the bipartisan farm bills in 2014 and 2018, which have provided much-needed stability for America's farmers and ranchers. Before representing Colorado in the Senate, Michael Bennet was a successful businessman. And as superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, he led one of the most extensive reform efforts in the country, resulting in substantial, sustained academic improvement for Denver's children. As anyone who has seen him in action as a senator or candidate can attest, he has a passion for issues relating to quality education and opportunity for young people, and a drive to continue to make things better. As a presidential candidate, he has been passionate and eloquent about providing opportunity for everyone to participate in the American dream and restoring integrity to our government. I know you can't wait to hear him. I can't either. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him now to his seat here, Colorado Senator and candidate for the Democratic nomination for President, Michael Bennet. And please welcome Stephanie Murray from Politico and the Playbook here in Massachusetts, who will be here talking to him. Thank you so much.
Good morning.
Thank you guys so much for being here, especially in the weather. We're going to get to our conversation shortly, but I'll just give Senator Bennet a chance to give some remarks, and thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'll be brief because I want to spend the time in a conversation with all of you. My name's Michael Bennet. I've been in the Senate for 10 years. You're sitting at my desk right there with the CEO. That is where I sit. And Teddy Kennedy's desk was right next to it. I want to thank you, Vicki, for having me. I can't tell you what it means to me to be here. I didn't know what it would mean for me to be here until I came into this room, and I feel incredibly lucky that your husband was still in the Senate when I got there. We were talking about it earlier this morning. I was sitting up at the desk presiding one day. I had no idea what I was doing because I'd just become a senator, and there I was sitting at the desk presiding over the United States Senate, which is a surprising place for anybody to be. And I heard this huge commotion coming out of this door and right over in this part of the chamber. And I had a gavel to hammer the gavel to get people to settle down, but I was unsure enough of what I was doing that I didn't do that. And I looked over, and what did I see but Ted Kennedy come through that door, and he had been out with cancer for months, and he'd come back for a very important vote. I don't remember what it was. I'm going to go look it up. And his colleagues streamed all across the floor to welcome him back. So never have I been gladder that I restrained myself, because if I had been gaveling Ted Kennedy, I would not be able to live with it. So that's something to remember. I just will say by way of introduction that I spent a lot of my life outside of politics. I was in business, as Vicki said. I was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, which is 95,000 kids in Colorado, mostly kids of color, mostly kids living in poverty. If I had to summarize the last 10 years of my town halls in Colorado, which is a state that's exactly 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democratic, and 1/3 independent, it's people coming to visit my meetings and saying, Michael, we're working really hard, but we can't afford housing, we can't afford health care, we can't afford higher education for ourselves or our kids, we can't afford early childhood education. In other words, we can't really afford what we used to think of and what I still think of as a middle-class life. You know, we can't save. We're worried that our kids are going to live a more diminished life than we lived. And if I think about the families that were in the Denver public schools who are not coming to my town halls because a lot of them are working 2 and 3 jobs to get by, if they did come, what they would say is, Michael, we're killing ourselves. And no matter what we do, we can't seem to get our kids out of poverty. And that is an anecdotal reflection of an economy that for the last 50 years or so has worked really well for the people at the very top. Sometimes we call them the top 10%, and hasn't worked very well for most everybody else. We've got an education system in America today that's reinforcing that income inequality instead of liberating children from it, because the best predictor of the quality of a kid's education is their parents' income. That's not the way this is supposed to work. That's not what Teddy Kennedy fought for when he was in the Senate. This is supposed to be a country where if you work hard, which almost everybody does, you can lift your family and you can grow economically. And I decided to run for president because I was really worried that if we spent another 10 years like the last 10 years, that my generation of Americans would be the first generation of Americans to leave less opportunity, not more, to the people that are coming after us. That's what Ted Kennedy fought for. That's what the Kennedy family fought for. And that's what I think it means to be an American. That is, you fight no matter what your job is. If you're a teacher or a student or a senator in the United States Senate, our job is to make sure the next generation has more opportunity than we had. And I believe very strongly that if we can pull ourselves together, we can unify our country, that there's no reason why we can't be a generation, my generation, that leaves more opportunity, not less, to people coming after us. And that's why I'm running for president. So I'm grateful that you're here today. I'm really looking forward to your questions. I often say, please ask me the questions you might not ask another politician because you'd be worried you might hurt their feelings. As I said earlier, I was an urban school superintendent for almost 5 years. You cannot hurt my feelings because they've been beaten out of me a long time ago. So thank you for having me, and thanks for being here.
So I just want to get started right away talking about something that I think is front of mind for a lot of Americans right now, which is impeachment. It seems like the impeachment trial will happen in the Senate in January, and I'm just curious about your thinking on impeachment and how it might impact your candidacy. I mean, you might get pulled off the trail right before some early states.
So whether I get pulled off the trail or not is not important to me because we have a constitutional obligation. The Senate, the 100 seats that you guys are occupying this morning, is the jury in an impeachment trial. We have a vote whether to acquit or to convict the president. It takes 2/3 to convict the president. The House has an impeachment proceeding, and then they refer it to the Senate. So it'll be interesting to see whether the majority leader, whose name is Mitch McConnell and who sits at that desk, it's going to be interesting to see whether he wants us there for a short period of time or a long period of time. That's up to him. And if he wants to inflict a lot of pain on the presidential candidates, we'll be there for a long period of time. But I think have you guys studied Watergate yet at all? A little bit? Yeah. Not in school. That was when we had the impeachment of Richard Nixon. I was a little younger than you are when that happened. But I remember it really well, and it was a very dark time in American history. We had the Vietnam War going on. We had a lot of divisions, sort of like we've got political divisions today. And that experience of having that impeachment actually was a victory in the end for the rule of law, and a victory for the idea that nobody is above the law, including the President of the United States. In that case, it was Richard Nixon. And I think in this case, President Trump has done some things where he's brought this on himself, and we're going to have to see as this process goes forward what the result's going to be. But I hope it becomes an opportunity for us to reestablish for the American people why the rule of law is so important. And the rule of law, again, is just a fancy way of saying that no one is above the law and that we're a nation of laws. They used to say, not a nation of men or of women. It doesn't matter who you are. You are the same in the eyes of the law. And that's kind of an essential aspect of living in a democracy like ours.
And let's talk a little bit about your presidential campaign. So between now and the New Hampshire primary in February, you're planning on doing 50 town halls, which is quite the haul. I think we've got around 60 days left until the election. So can you tell us why you're betting on New Hampshire and really throwing all of your energy? just above the border here.
Yeah, I'm not a very well-known politician. I'm not a celebrity politician, and I'm not as well-known as some of the people in the race. So I haven't been very high in the polls. There might be other reasons why that's true, but that's one of the reasons why. And so I've decided I'm going to spend the next 60 days in 50 town halls in New Hampshire, and I'm just going to go place to place to place to place, answering every question, taking whatever criticism anybody has, and staying until the last question is answered. That's a style of campaigning that I love. It's it's the way I am a senator at home in that state that's a third Democratic, a third Republican, and a third Independent. When we were passing the Affordable Care Act with Ted Kennedy and others in 2009 and 10, when President Obama was president, they were telling people back in Washington, don't even have a town hall meeting, because it was the Tea Party was going crazy and all that stuff. And I went to the reddest parts of Colorado and had town halls. So that's my style of campaigning. And sometimes it works in New Hampshire. My friend, Ted Kennedy's friend, John McCain, had a lot of success showing up in meeting after meeting after meeting, and I'm trying to replicate that.
And do you think that, I mean, you've mentioned Colorado is a third. Do you see Colorado as a swing state in 2020?
I absolutely do, yep.
And why is that?
Because it's a purple state. You know, we go either way, Democrat or Republican, it depends. It's very challenging to be a senator from a state like that. And I've noticed that it puts me in a kind of a different place than some of the other people running for president. When you represent a state that's a third, you learn quickly that you need to say the same thing in the primary that you say in the general election. And the same thing in urban parts of the state that you say in rural parts of the state, because people are listening for whether you're pandering to them or not, or whether you're not sure about what you're trying to say. I've noticed with some of these other folks that are from very blue states that they don't have to have that same discipline. And there's a view that you just sort of take one position to try to win the primary and then another position to win the general election. It's been fascinating to see that, and actually it's taught me a little more about my colleagues in the Senate and why we have differences, because we do have differences based on the states we're from and the politics of those states.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. I mean, in the past, it's almost a year or so that folks have been in the race. A lot of the conversation is hinged on healthcare and Medicare for all. Do you think that a candidate espousing Medicare for all can beat Donald Trump? I
think it's going to be very hard. I wouldn't say that they couldn't beat him, but I think it creates a real challenge, because Medicare for all makes illegal all insurance across the country, private insurance except for cosmetic insurance, and it raises taxes by about $31 trillion, which is the equivalent of 70% of all the revenue that the federal government's going to collect over the next 10 years. So that's almost doubling the amount of taxes that we're going to collect to take people's private insurance away. I just don't think that's going to happen. And, you know, I believe really strongly that we should have a goal of ending poverty in this generation. That's a goal I think that Ted Kennedy would have shared. And I have a proposal called the American Family Act that would cut childhood poverty in America in 1 year by 40%. It would end the $2 a day poverty in this country for kids. And it would cost just 3% of what Medicare for all would cost. So my concern about Medicare for all is less that we might lose the presidential election, which I'm worried about, but it's that we could spend the next 10 years fighting a losing battle for Medicare for all, instead of fighting a winning battle to end childhood poverty and to deal with climate change, both of which we have to do.
So you've been in this race for quite some time. I was looking through photos that I had on my computer of the first time that I covered you in New Hampshire, and that was back in March. And so I'm wondering...
That's the first time I went, yeah.
I know, it feels like a lifetime ago.
Tell me about it.
So what's missing in this race? I mean, what's been left out of the conversation that you feel like Democrats should have been talking about this entire time?
I think the next generation of Americans. I think that's what this race should be about. If we were focused on the next generation of Americans, you know, as a former school superintendent, I don't think we'd be, you know, the Democratic Party would be standing for free college, for example. I think we'd be standing for free preschool. I think we'd be standing for what are we doing for the 70% of kids that graduate from high school and don't go to college so they can earn a living wage when they graduate from high school, not just the minimum wage. You know, I think we'd be standing for my plan to end childhood poverty instead of Medicare for all. So that's why I've stayed in the race, because I think we're going to be judged, properly so, on what we do for you guys. I was with actually I can say it here, the former president of Harvard not that long ago. And I asked her to tell me about the political activity on her campus. She's not there anymore, but she was there. And she said, everybody hates politics and everybody hates politicians. And I said, well, I know some of these guys, and I don't like some of them myself. But then I said, tell me about what the political activity was like when you were a student. And she was a student during the 60s, the late 60s, the Vietnam War. And she said, we thought our country needed us to survive. We thought our country would fail without us. And that's what I think about all of you. We need you to survive. We're going to fail without you. And we need you involved in this today. My generation's not doing the job we should do for all of you. In terms of the debt that, that is on the balance sheet of this country, that the lack of investment that we're making in our infrastructure, the fact that we haven't gotten to universal health care or universal preschool, or ended childhood poverty, as I mentioned earlier, or are addressing climate in the way that it needs to be addressed. All of those things need to get worked on. And if we don't start working on them now, we may be handing you something that you're not going to be able to fix, which is why it's so important for you to be involved in this. You don't need to wait until you're 18 when you have the chance to vote. Even now, you could make sure that everybody in your community that's eligible to vote actually does cast a vote in November. That's an important thing that you can do, and you can get involved in your community. So I think that that's what has been missing in the campaign, and I've been pleased to at least have a chance to make this case.
So I'll ask one more question, and I think we'll turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. We're gearing up for another Democratic debate, and I am just curious, do you think the debates matter? I was reading something from Morning Consult yesterday that most Americans hadn't watched or even paid attention to the debates.
I think they're unwatchable. That's why and I was talking to somebody in New Hampshire the other day who was saying to me, the debates have become a lose-lose proposition. You make it on the debate stage, and that's the good news, and the bad news is you have to be on the debate stage. And if you don't make it on, and I've been on and now I haven't, the bad news is you're not on, and the good news is you're on. And I think we have to revisit it. It's not useful to the American people to watch a politician stand up there trying to figure out how to say something witty in 30 seconds. That's not what I want to know about the next president. I want to know whether they understand the challenges that we're facing as a country and the challenges that we're facing in this world, and whether they have some ideas about how we're going to fix it. That's what I'm interested in knowing, and I don't think the debates really tell us that.
So if anyone has a question, I believe we have some microphones around the audience. You can just raise your hand.
I'm, again, happy to take questions on any topic at all. Don't feel the need to restrict yourself to anything we've been talking about. I'm happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
I think we've got one over here.
Sorry.
I'm not quite sure whose seat you're in, but I know whose seat you're in the Abercrombie & Fitch. That is my friend Lamar Alexander, who is a Republican from Tennessee and is chairman of the Education Committee and is a wonderful man.
Look at that, Isaiah.
He does not wear an Abercrombie & Fitch sweatshirt.
I hope not.
Yes.
Honestly, what are your...
Can you tell me your name?
Oh, my name is Tegan. What are your honest, personal, tangible aspirations in the scope of your life?
It's to make your life better.
So, in your own personal life,
Yeah.
of what goals do you want to reach in your own standing?
I just think that, I read once, I think that I'm living that life. My wife Susan and I are raising 3 daughters who are now 20, 19, and 15. They were 9, 7, and 5 when I became a senator. So they've been engaged in this work with me the whole time, and that's a great privilege to have been able to be together as a family and be a public servant. You know, when I was in the second grade, we were asked to line up in my classroom in order of whose family was here the longest and whose family was here the shortest period of time. And my family turned out to be the answer to both of those questions. So on my dad's side, they could trace it all the way back to the Mayflower. And on my mom's side, they were Polish Jews who had survived the Holocaust and who had really, really recently, my mom and her parents were the only ones that survived. And they lived in Warsaw for a couple years, and then they went to Stockholm, Sweden for a year, Mexico City for a year, and then they came here, the only place in the world where they could rebuild their shattered lives. And actually, they had an art gallery in Warsaw, and they started that art gallery again in New York, and Jack Kennedy was a frequent patron of theirs. In fact, I have a book at home that's a photograph book of John F. Kennedy, the president, and inside it there's a note that says, "To Michael F. Bennet," that's me, "President Kennedy thought about you and your generation, signed Robert F. Kennedy." And that's what I think it's all about. You know, my dad was a public servant his whole life, and he taught us that public service was noble, and so I'm proud to have the chance to be that. And I traveled the country broadly, and I've never met anybody that has a stronger accent than my grandparents had. And I've never met anybody who were greater patriots than my grandparents were. And that they believed that this country had done everything for them, and they thought they'd given back to the country. And that's how it's all supposed to work. So I'm a very lucky person because I think I've actually fulfilled the goals that they had set for me, and I continue to try to do it every day. I just try to get better at it. John Kennedy was asked once what the most important attribute of a public servant was, or a politician. He said something very unusual for a politician, which is, he said, curiosity. And I agree with that. I think that as long as you are trying to learn everything you can about the world in which you live, you're going to find something interesting to do, and you're going to be good at it. And so I wish that for you.
So, knowing that your mom or your mother was a Holocaust survivor, and
She's my mom. That's okay. Yeah.
and your father is a former U.S. diplomat, how would you say your parents' experiences shaped you as a person today?
Yeah, they really did. I mean, you know, my dad's experience was, again, he worked for the Senate for a lot of his life. He was what we now call a chief of staff, or it was then called an administrative assistant for several senators, and he worked for one of the Senate committees, and then he went and worked in the State Department. And it really was the idea that public service is noble and that we have an obligation to help other people. I was in business for a while, which is something that he would never have been interested in or known. But I will say, having been in business, it has really helped me be a better public servant. So I think that you can do a range of different things. And one of the things he always told me was, find something that you're really passionate about and do it as well as you can. And then when it's time to do something else, that other option will present itself to you. And that's sort of how I have lived my life, and it was pretty good advice, so I pass that along to you as well. I don't think it matters what you pick, private sector, public sector, nonprofit, as long as it's something that you're passionate about. And from my mom's experience, it was to not take any of this for granted, you know, and I don't think we can take any of this for granted today. The democracy is something that we build every single day of our lives. When I have middle school kids come to see me sometime in Washington, which I love, or high school kids, because I used to be a school superintendent, they go before they rarely get to see this. In fact, they almost never get to see this, sometimes very rarely. But they'll come to my office after they've been in the, they've seen the Washington Monument and have any of you been to Washington before? It's a couple. So you've seen pictures of it, so there's, like the Lincoln Memorial and the White House and the Supreme Court. And there's a tendency for them to think that it was all just here. And of course, none of it was just here. I mean, 230 years ago, none of it was here. This wasn't here. And there are some people that we call the founders, who did two incredible things in their generation. They led an armed insurrection that was successful against a colonial power. We call that the Revolutionary War. A lot of those people or some of those people were from your hometown. I guarantee you of that. And some of them were your age when it happened. And they were involved in that. It's an amazing thing to think about. And the other thing they did that was incredible was they wrote a constitution that would be ratified by the people that would live under that constitution. That had never happened before in human history. They also did something really terrible, which is they perpetrated human slavery. And they didn't have to do that, but they did. And it took other Americans to end that, and I tell kids about Frederick Douglass in particular. Abraham Lincoln was the president when we ended slavery, but Frederick Douglass was a human being in America who was born a slave, an enslaved human. This was like 100 years before I was born. It wasn't a million years before I was born. And he went to Massachusetts, where we are today, and ended up, I think, on Martha's Vineyard with a bunch of abolitionists who were leading the movement against slavery. And the abolitionists were arguing that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. And Frederick Douglass said, "You have this exactly wrong." Frederick Douglass was completely self-taught, by the way. He said, "You have this completely wrong. The Constitution is an anti-slavery document. We're just not living up to the words in the Constitution," which is exactly the same thing that Dr. King said the night before he was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was there for the striking garbage workers. And he said, "I am here to force America to keep the promise you wrote down on the page." And in my mind, Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King are as much founders as the people who wrote the Constitution. And the women mostly that fought so my women would have the right to vote, they are founders as much as the men who wrote the Constitution. And my mom and her grandparents, I think, are founders as well. And I think every single person in this room is one. And you have to think about your responsibility as a citizen in a democratic republic as that elevated a sense of responsibility. This place is going to rise or fall. It's going to live or die based on what you do and how seriously you take that responsibility. And that's what I learned from my parents. So I'm now passing that on to you. Thank you for that question.
I think we've got time for a couple more, maybe from this side of the room.
I'll be briefer in my... How are you?
I'm good, and you?
What's your name?
Rifleen?
I didn't ask your name. Aya, thank you.
Yeah. So most of us here are high school seniors, and we're on our way to college. I just want to know if you have a plan. How are you going to help us, like our generation and future generations, tackle on college debt?
Thank you.
Since it's a big problem in America.
It's a huge problem, and it's one of the. It didn't have to be this way. There is no law written up in the sky somewhere that says that we should force you into having to pay back 25 years worth of student loans just for the privilege of going to college. But we have made college very expensive, and we're no longer funding college the way we used to when I was your age. And that's why your generation's having to bear this expense, and it's deeply unfair. So I think the most important thing we can do is reduce the cost of college. And if I am elected president, that is something that I will lead a discussion in with all 50 governors of the states to say, this is ridiculous. And we have to find a way to do something other than just raise the price of college every year and then have the federal loan program just lend into that increasing expense. That's not going to do you very much good because you're going to college next year, and it's going to take some years for us to get this under control. So what I've proposed is that we reduce the amount of money that you have to pay as part of your income when you graduate from college on student loans. I think you should also be able to renegotiate the rates to get them as low as possible and to have the federal government help you do that. And I think that, and I guess that's basically it. There are some people that are running for president saying they're for, forgiving everybody's student loan. I have not taken that position because there are a lot of people in this country who don't have any chance to go to college who are saying, wait a minute, if you're going to forgive people's student loans, why aren't you forgiving me my mortgage, or other loan that I have? I wish I had the chance to go to college. Why don't you pay for me to go to college? So these are the kinds of things you need to take in, your mind when you're thinking about whether these are good ideas or not good ideas, but that's what I would do. Thanks.
All right, one more.
Why don't we take, is it all right, if it's all right with these guys, let's take like 4 really quick ones. And I'll
Yeah, sure.
Okay, if that's all right. Is that all right? Is that all right? Is it all right? Okay,
We're getting a
let's do
thumbs
that.
up.
So I want to know your thoughts.
What's your name?
Oh, Ashley. I want to know your thoughts about climate change because I know that there's some bans on plastic bags and some states are changing plastic straws to like paper straws. I just want to know like your thoughts on what you hope to accomplish at the end.
So what I believe is that we really have to deal with climate change urgently, and because the climate is warming there, and some things could become irreversible, and then we can't fix it anymore. So there was an article yesterday about what's happening in the Arctic with what's called permafrost, which is stuff that's supposed to be frozen forever, which is now not frozen and is leaching CO2, which is the bad climate greenhouse gas that we don't want to have. But it's a really great question because you're sitting in this Senate chamber, and I was asked a question the other day by somebody on the campaign trail whether democracy could solve climate change. And it is an incredible question because it's not just about acting urgently. I just said we have to act urgently. We also have to create a solution that will last for a generation. But if you accept our current politics in Washington, where I put my ideas in for 2 years, the other side rips them out. I put them in for 2 years, the other side rips them out. You can't solve climate 2 years at a time. We need a generational answer to climate change, which means we need a durable solution, not just an urgent solution. And we're going to have something that we think of ultimately as American climate policy. Like we used to have something called American foreign policy. And when we had American foreign policy, even though we elected a Democrat or a Republican, the president knew what their job was with respect to the Soviet Union or the Cold War, or the transatlantic alliance. We got to get there on climate too, which means we have to actually recreate our political system. Yeah, because we've got to create a system where we can create durable solutions again, things that will last 10 and 20 and 30 years. Ted Kennedy worked on that stuff all the time when he was in the Senate. That wasn't ancient history. And that's where we have to get back to. The current situation isn't going to yield a solution to climate. And this is the one, there's so many reasons why you guys should be upset at my generation, but this is the one you're really going to get us for, because I think a lot of you think correctly that if we don't start working on climate now, you might not have a chance to actually address it. And that's why we got to address it. And that's another place where you can be involved today. There's no reason for you to wait. You need to let your elected representatives know that this is an issue that you care about at every level. At the local level, that's probably where you're going to have the debate about plastic bags, which is an important one to have. And then at the national level, we'll have a debate about how to control greenhouse gases. And your voice can be really important to whether we have that debate, what the nature of that debate is, and whether we create that durable solution that I'm talking about.
Hello, good morning. My name is Brandon, and I have a question for you. So, if you became president, what are your plans for immigration?
Thank you very much for that question. And I mentioned to you earlier about my own family's immigrant history, and that's one of the reasons I'm interested in this. The other reason I'm interested in it is my old school district, Denver Public Schools, was 57% Hispanic, 20% African American, and 20% white. So give you, and of the 57% of the kids who were Hispanic, a lot of the kids were dreamers, kids who came here through no fault of their own and know no other country but the United States. And so I was really, really lucky. In 2013, I was part of the Gang of Eight that wrote the immigration bill in the Senate. Mrs. Kennedy talked about it earlier. It was 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. We spent 7 months working together behind closed doors. We created an immigration bill that then went to the Judiciary Committee. It had over 100 amendments were adopted or considered, and I think maybe 150 altogether were considered. Then it came right here to the floor of the Senate. We had more amendments that were adopted here, and we passed it with 68 votes. And that bill had a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million people that live in this country who are undocumented. It had the most progressive DREAM Act that had ever been conceived, much less passed. And something Donald Trump can't remember, it had $46 billion of border security in it. Not $6 billion for the wall that Mexico was supposed to pay for, but $46 billion so we could see every single inch of the border, and we knew who came here lawfully on their visas but overstayed their visas. That's what we should be doing. And if I were president, that is what we would be doing. And the only reason it's not the law of the land is the House of Representatives killed it through something called the Hastert Rule. That's what it's called, the Hastert Rule, which was a rule that said that for you to pass a bill in the House, which is over there in the Capitol building, you go walk to the other end of that hallway, and there's another chamber much larger than this chamber called the House of Representatives. And they said it takes a majority of a majority to vote through a bill, which meant that there was a group of people there. They call themselves the Freedom Caucus or the Tea Party. It's about 40 people who represent a minority view in this country. They're not a majority view. And they said, we're not going to give you the votes. And they killed the legislation. It was very anti-democratic, small d democratic. So I think that's what we have to resurrect. And I think this is one of the reasons, in my mind, Donald Trump should be a one-term president, because we have never had a president in my lifetime as anti-immigrant as Donald Trump. We've never had a president in my lifetime as anti-refugee as Donald Trump. And that's not who America is supposed to be. So we almost got it done. And I think if I'm elected president, we'll pass a bill along the same lines, only this time we'll actually get it through the House of Representatives.
Hi, my name is Helena, and I wanted to ask...
Your name is what?
Helena.
How do you spell it?
H-E-L-I-N-A.
H what?
H-E-L-I-N-A.
E-L-I-N-A?
Yeah.
So my grandmother's name is Helena, H-A-L-I-N-A. She is my Polish Jewish grandmother, and my second daughter's name is Helena, H-A-L-I-N-A. It's very unusual to meet a Helena, so one vowel different, yeah.
So my question is, what are your views on raising taxes on the rich and capitalism?
So my view on capitalism is that it has done a lot of good in the world. I mean, it's lifted a lot of people out of poverty in the world. It has not worked very well the last 50 years in America. And we need to recognize that fact. I mean, when you're living in a country where for 50 years, the bottom 90% of Americans have had their income be completely flat, and the top 0.1%, the top 1%, the top 5%, the top 10% have all seen their income go like that, there's something wrong, especially when, as I said earlier, you've got an education system that's actually reinforcing that inequality. And we do have the greatest income inequality that we've had in 100 years, since 1928. We have to address it, A democracy cannot survive without shared prosperity, without everybody benefiting when the economy grows. And we have to get back to that. And I think we can get back to that by investing again in America, which we haven't been doing for the last 20 years. We have since 2001, we've cut taxes by $5 trillion on the wealthiest people in America. Since 2001, we've spent $5.6 trillion fighting these 20-year-long wars in the Middle East that started before you were born. That's what we've been spending our money on. And by the way, we didn't pay for any of it. We borrowed all that money from China, so you're going to have to pay it back if we don't get our act together. That's $12 or $13 trillion we could have invested in our education system, in our infrastructure, to drive economic growth for everybody. And that's when we do drive economic growth for everybody, when we make those kinds of investments. So that's point one. Point two, we do need to tax the wealthiest people in this country, and we're not doing it. And if I were president, I would reverse the Trump tax bill to go back to where we were in the taxes for the wealthiest people. I would make sure that investors were treated the same way as working people in terms of the taxes they paid. Today, working people pay, this rate, and if you own stocks and bonds, you pay this rate. That's ridiculous. We should bring this rate up to this rate. And we're living at a time when there are these massive estates that are being passed from one wealthy generation to the next generation. We never were supposed to live in a country with an aristocracy that just passed its wealth down to the next generation. So we should be taxing that as well. And I think if we did those three things, that would be a big step to getting us back to where we need to be.
And I think we're going to leave it
How
there.
about one last one,
Okay.
and then we're done. I'll walk out of here. I'll get out of your hair. I know you guys have important work to do debating the Affordable Care Act.
Hi, I'm Saida. I just wanted to ask about, as we're sitting here right now, there are Muslims in concentration camps in China. So if you are elected president, how do you plan to work with foreign leaders on human rights policies?
Thank you for that question. That group of people, for those of you that don't know, is called the Uyghurs. And what the Chinese have been doing is absolutely devastating. And we need an American president who will stand up for our values around the world. That's going on in the world. Saudi Arabia murdered a journalist that was living in America named Khashoggi, and they lured them from America to Turkey to kill them, and the president didn't stand up to that either. So what we're learning right now is that if America doesn't stand up, nobody else will. And that's why we have to. And I am the first person, I'll say, the first person to say that we have not set a perfect example for the rest of the world. We never have. You remember what I said at the very beginning? We had these people that founded the country saying, doing those two incredible things, but also perpetrating human slavery. It's never been a story of perfection. That's not the point. What it has been a story of is constant struggle to overcome adversity and to make our country more democratic, small d democratic, more fair and more free. That's what generation after generation after generation of Americans have done, never perfectly and never completely, which is why you guys all have a ton of work to do. We don't live in a just society today. But the point of that is not to give up, it's to fight injustice. And that's what you guys need to do. And even though we're not a perfect example, we are the best example that the world has. We're the best example. And I know from my mom and her parents how important that example is to people around the rest of the world who are trying to be free and are hoping for something better for their kids and for their grandkids. And it's that example that we have to restore. And really, I think that's what this whole project is all about, I'll bet, when Teddy Kennedy wanted this as his legacy, was to remind people of the genius of our democracy. The genius of our democracy is not that it always works. It often doesn't work. It's often really inefficient, and it's often really unfair. The genius of it is when we figure out how to make it work. and we figure out how to reflect the pluralism, the diversity of ideas that exists in our society. Those people that founded this country did not found it believing that we would agree with each other. That wasn't the point. The point of being in a republic, what they called a republic, what we call democracy, was actually that we would disagree with each other. And they believed out of those disagreements, it's not that we would create some lazy, moderate compromise. It's that out of those disagreements, we would create more imaginative and more durable solutions than any king or tyrant could come up with on their own. That was the whole idea. When you think about it in your own life, it makes perfect sense. The worst decisions I make are the ones I make by myself, at home. The best decisions I make are the ones I make when I'm dealing with someone else's point of view or perspective or knowledge and taking their position into account. And that's what this chamber is all about. These people, these 100 people that have the good fortune to represent 330 million people in this tiny, tiny chamber, they come from states that bear almost no resemblance to each other, political parties that have disagreements, personal experiences that are totally different from one another. But the reason this whole thing was created by the Founding Fathers, and that is who created this, is so we can have that disagreement and we can come to a result, and never a perfect one. And the whole world watches what happens here. And that's why I think standing up for our values, whether it's China or anybody else, is really, really important. And every year that we don't do it, those values erode more, you know, because every single year, just like we're founding the country every year, we're renewing our commitment to those values every single year in what we do. Whether we're high school students or a senator, it doesn't matter. We have exactly the same responsibility. I want to thank you guys for having me today. I really appreciate it. Mrs. Kennedy, thank you for having me. And thank you for being here as well. It's great to see you. I wish you luck today.